materials you're going to need for this Cats in a Moonlight Cityscape painting are a 9x12 stretch canvas. Now in terms of the paint colors, you're going to need Mars Black, Titanium White, Ultramarine Blue, Cadmium Red Medium Hue, and Cadmium Yellow Medium Hue. Now in terms of paintbrushes, you're going to need a 3/4 inch flat wash brush, a 1/4 inch angled brush, a size 5 round brush, and any small detailing brush or a size 0 detailing brush. And you're also going to need a palette knife, your palette, a rag or paper towel, and a jar of clean water. So the first step of this painting is we're going to paint in the background, which is the night sky of this composition. So for that, we're going to take some Mars Black, and we're just going to add a few dollops of the top of the canvas because we want our night sky to be darkest at the top of the painting. And then we're going to take our ultramarine blue, and we're going to add a few more dollops of that below the black. So it's going to be a little bit lighter towards the horizon. You can just add a few dollops like that, and if you run out of paint, you can always add more as we go, like that. And we're going to actually blend that paint right onto the canvas, right on canvas. So we're going to take our 3/4 inch flat wash brush, we're going to wet it in just a little bit of water and take the excess water out on the sides of the jar, like that. And then we're just going to take these horizontal back and forth strokes, and we're just going to blend out that paint right on our canvas, just like that. So you're going to let that blue and that black mix, and it's going to be like a darker blue right at the top of that canvas, mixed in with that black. So you're just going to take these, you're just going to use these back and forth strokes to blend out that paint, and take your time. And if you find the paint is becoming harder to blend, then you can take a little bit more water on your brush so the paint gets a little bit more fluid and it's easier to move across the canvas. Just like that. And we're going to use that blue about 3/4 of the way down, and then we're going to stop there because the fence is going to go at the bottom of the composition. So I'm just taking a little bit more water so my paint gets a little bit more fluid and moves across that canvas evenly. Just like that. And you can take a little bit of that blue and you can bring it up. If it's a little bit too dark at the top, you can take a little bit of that blue and bring it right at the top of the painting. And also too, if you are going to hang this on the wall, you can go ahead and paint the sides of your canvas at this point as well. And again, if you run out of paint and you want a little bit more paint, you can just, don't be shy to take a little bit more of your blue and just add it right on your canvas. And when you're happy with your background, then we are going to leave that to dry for the next step. So the next step of this painting is we're going to be creating our splatter stars. Now this step can get a little bit messy, so if you have a surface underneath that you don't want paint to get on, you can use a protective covering on top of it. Now to create the actual splatter stars, we're going to use our titanium white paint, and we're just going to grab any little small container, and you're just going to add just a little bit of that white paint in your container, and then we're going to thin it down with some water. So just a little blob like that. And then you can take your paintbrush and you can transfer in some water. And we want it quite liquid and not thick, like right out of the tube. So you're gonna add in a few drops of water, and then you can mix it around with your paintbrush. And you want it nice and fluid, so when you tip over the container, it's gonna move nice and fluidly. You can always add in more water as you go if you find it still too thick. You want a consistency like a soup, not like a thick gravy, but a soup. So once you have it, that nice soupy consistency, then you're gonna take, I'm gonna use a small brush here, but you can use any brush you want. So once your paintbrush is loaded with that liquidy white paint, You can take any other surface that's dark, and you can practice your splatter stars before you add them onto your painting if you'd like. So I'm just going to take that loaded paintbrush, and then I'm going to simply tap it on that second paintbrush to create the splatter stars. So you can see the first few stars that I tapped were a little bit bigger, and then the other ones are going to be a much finer mist. So there we go. So once you're happy with that, you can just add a little bit more onto your paintbrush, and you can go ahead and start tapping away. You can move the paintbrush all around the canvas so the stars get all over the background. And then in later steps too, and when you find like the paint has run out and you're not getting quite as much stars anymore, you can just go ahead and reload that on. And if you find some of the stars are a little bit too big, you can come with while the paint is still wet, you can actually just come with a little bit of a rag here and wipe it. So as long as the paint is still wet, you can remove some of the stars if you find they're a little bit too big. I'm gonna come again with a little bit of white. I'm just gonna create some splatters. This part is really fun. It gets messy for sure, but sometimes getting a little bit messy is fun in itself. So when you're happy with the amount of stars you've added to your background, we're gonna leave that to dry, and the next step, we're gonna come back and we're gonna paint in the fence. So the next step of this painting is creating in our fence at the bottom of our composition. So to do that is we're going to be sketching it in first, and then following that, we're going to be mixing our brown paint and then filling in that sketch. So the first part of that sketch, we're going to be taking a ruler and a pencil. I'm going to be using a white gel pen just because it's easier to see on camera, but you can use a simple pencil and any ruler you have. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a horizontal line across the canvas at the bottom, about 4 inches from the bottom of the canvas. So we're just going to take our ruler and we're going to be creating a simple horizontal line right across. Just like that. Okay, and then about a 1/4 inch below that, we're going to create another horizontal line, and that's just going to act like a guideline to create those zigzags at the top of our fence. So we're going to create another horizontal line, a 1/4 inch of the way down. Like that. So once you're done drawing in those 2 lines, we're going to be creating our zigzag pattern. So I'll show you on the painting I've already created. So we're essentially just going to make the top of the fence, which is this nice zigzag pattern right across the canvas. So we're just going to take our pencil, or I'm just going to take my gel pen here, and we're just going to create those zigzags. Like that. And this just makes it easier to, having a sketch before you painting it in, just makes it a little bit easier to paint in the object. Okay. So basically we have now our top of our fence sketched in, and now we're going to draw the lines in between our fence. So we're just going to take our ruler and our pencil or white gel pen, and we're just going to create our vertical lines. Just like that. You can also simply, if you don't want to do the sketch, you can just go straight to the paint part as well. But if you'd like to have a sketch before you paint it in, then you can create that one. You can create a sketch to make it easier. So once the sketch of the fence is filled in, we're going to now paint it in with some brown paint. Now you can definitely use some pre-mixed brown paint if you have that on hand. If you don't have brown paint on hand, you can just mix it with your primary colors you have on hand, which is red, yellow, and blue. So any red, yellow, and blue that you have will work to create a brown paint. And we're also going to use some white to lighten it up. So to create our brown paint, we're just going to add a dollop or two of that paint right onto our palette. Just a little bit like that. We can always add more as we go. So that's red. That's our yellow. And so for this painting, I'm using the Cad Red Medium, the Cadmium Yellow Medium, and the Ultramarine, but any red, yellow, and blue will work to create a brown. Because when you mix primary colors, they mix a brown. Okay, and then we're going to add in white on the side too, and then we can use that to lighten up the brown. But first we're gonna mix the brown. So to mix, I like to use a palette knife, but a lot of people like to use a brush. So if you don't have a palette knife, that's okay. You can go ahead and use a brush as well to mix your paint. So we're just going to take all those 3 primary colors and we're just gonna mix them up together. And you should start seeing a nice, beautiful brown color emerge when you mix all those primary colors together. Now that's quite dark. So that's why we have some white on our palette and we're gonna lighten that up. But we first mix the brown and then we can lighten as we go. So once your brown is nice and mixed, then we're gonna add in a little bit of white at a time. So just a little bit on your palette knife like that. You're gonna mix it in. And we're trying to aim for kind of a medium brown color like that. So I think I'm gonna add in a little bit more white. And also one thing to note is with acrylic colors, some of them do dry a little bit darker. So when they're wet, they are a little bit lighter, and then when they actually dry, they dry 1 or 2 shades a little bit darker. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you're mixing your colors. Okay, so I'm happy with that. That's a nice medium brown. So we're just gonna take the excess off the paint. The palette knife. And then we're gonna grab our, just gonna put my rag here, and we're gonna grab our 1/4 inch angled brush for painting in the fence, because the angled portion of the brush is really gonna help us get those nice angles at the top of our fence. So we're gonna take our angled brush and we're just gonna load it with a little bit of water and then remove the excess water on the side of our jar. That. Then we're gonna grab a little bit of that brown, medium brown paint we just created, and we're gonna fill in our fence. So what I like to do is I like to fill in the top portion first. So you're gonna take the angled portion of that angle brush and you're gonna use it to create in the top part of that fence along that sketch, just like that. So I like to go along the top portion of the fence first. And having that sketch there is really useful. But some people prefer not to sketch, and that's okay too. And using that angled chiseled edge of your paintbrush to create some nice straight lines. And you can reload once your brush runs out of paint. You can just reload it with that brown paint. And when you're done that, now it becomes much easier to just paint in the bottom portion of your fence because the top guideline is already there. So then you're just going to paint in the bottom part of the fence. I like to do it on the flat side. So you're just going to take it down like that and just paint in the fence. That. And then we're going to come in a later step and we're going to be creating some nice texture to our fence in a darker brown color. So we're just going to paint this in first, and then we can mix a darker brown to get some nice texture in our fence. So you're going to do that all the way down until your fence is completely covered with that medium brown paint. And if you're displaying it on the wall, you can also go ahead and paint in the sides of your painting as well with this brown color. Now once your fence is dry to the touch, we're going to move on to the next step of the fence, which is creating in this lovely dark texture over top of that brown, which is going to go on the fence panels. So to do that, we're going to mix a slightly darker brown than one we currently have on the canvas. So to do that, we're going to grab our Mars Black, and we're going to put just a dollop of it on our palette. And when mixing black with any color, it quickly overpowers. So we want to just mix in a tiny bit of black at a time to darken our brown. So we have a little bit of brown on our palette, and we're going to grab our palette knife or paintbrush and add in just a little bit of black into our brown mixture, and we're going to mix it to make a darker brown. And see, it goes dark pretty fast with just a tiny amount of black. And with this dark brown, we wanted to have contrast between the brown that's on the canvas right now and this dark brown. So what we can do is we can grab our brush. We're going to be using the same 1/4 inch angled brush, and we can load it up on our paintbrush and just test it out on our fence to see if it gives us enough contrast. So here it's kind of, you can see it, but I think I wanted to add it a little bit darker. So I'm going to add in just a little bit more black on my palette knife and mix it in. So we're going to take our angled brush, we're going to load that dark brown paint on, and we're just going to have fun here. And we're going to create these vertical, they're going to be at random places, just these vertical marks that's going to add texture to our fence panels. So we're just going to take the chiseled edge of our angled brush, and we're just going to create some nice random vertical lines on those panels. And then the next step, we're going to add an even darker color so we can see the lines between the panels and a little bit of shadow at the top. So if you find your brown is not as dark as you'd like, you can go ahead and keep on adding a little bit of black in until you get that ideal dark brown color. That gives you enough contrast between both the colors. And here it's looking like it's not quite as dark as I'd like still, so I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more black. It's always good to add a little bit black at a time. So we're just going to take our chiseled edge and just add these nice little swoops down. And you can add them in random places. They don't have to be perfect. Just want to recreate that wood look. Some could be thicker, some could be thinner. Just have fun here. You can reload your brush once you run out of paint. If you find your paint is also a little bit thick, you can go ahead and add a little bit of water on your paintbrush and thin it down just to get a little bit more fluid paint. Sometimes that's easier to create these vertical texture lines as well. Okay, so once you're happy with your vertical texture lines, we're going to come now and create an even darker brown. So we're going to add in the rest of our black that we've added onto our palette, and we're going to mix it into that brown to make a really dark brown. Very close to black, but still brown. So that's really nice and dark. So now we're going to be creating these vertical lines that are going to separate between each panel. And then we're going to add a little bit of a black border at the top of the fence too, because when we add the gray paint of the building in the background in a later step, it just gives a little bit more contrast between the fence and the building, so it just looks a little bit nicer that way. So to do that, we're going to grab our angled brush, and we're going to thin down that paint just a little because we want finer lines. It's easier to control paint and make finer lines when the paint is a little bit thinner. So add a little bit of water into that paint to make it just a smidgen thinner. And we're going to load up that brush. And first we're going to make sure that that dark brown color is dark enough. And then we're just going to create those lines that we created in our sketch. If you can still see them, you can use them as guidelines. If not, you can actually just grab your ruler and you can use that as a guideline to create those lines in. So we're just going to paint that, and then you can lift off and see, so that you can see that that's quite a bit darker than the brown we mixed in the last step. So that's going to give us that nice separation between the panels. So you're going to continue that down. If you don't have a ruler, you can just freehand it as well. They're just basically simple vertical lines. You can do this all the way down. So the next step after we've added in the shadows between the fence panels is we're going to add that same shadow at the top zigzag part of the fence with that same brown and your angled brush. So we're just going to grab a little bit more of that dark brown with our angled brush, and we're just going to add it a thin line at the top of that zigzag along that fence, just like that. And once you run out of paint, you can just reload that paintbrush. So when that part is done, we're going to wait for that to dry. And then the next step, we're going to come in with a pencil and a ruler, and we're going to trace in the shapes of the buildings. So after your fence is all dried to the touch, we're going to move on to creating our sketch of our buildings in the background. Now what you're going to need for that is a simple pencil and a ruler. Now I'm going to be showing you with a paint marker because it's easier to see on camera, but you can go ahead and use a pencil and a ruler. Now you can follow along in terms of design, you can follow along with me with this pattern here of these buildings. Or another idea is you can look online for buildings in your own city, like a skyline picture, and you can do that if you want to do a custom buildings in the background. So I'm just going to pick up my ruler and my paint marker, and I'm going to start tracing in those buildings. So the next step after you've sketched in your buildings is we're going to fill them in with a nice gray paint. So you can see here that's like a nice medium gray. So we're going to mix that using a simple black and a white. So we're just going to add a little bit of black on our palette. Like that, a dollop of black and a little bit more white than black. We don't want it to be too dark gray, we want it to be a medium dark gray. So a little bit of white like that. And we're going to take our palette knife and we're just going to mix the white and the black together. And we can always adjust too. So if you find your gray is looking a little bit too pale, you can always add a little bit more black in, and vice versa. If you find that your gray is a little bit too dark, you can always add white in to lighten it up. So that's looking really nice, and I am happy with that because that's also going to dry a couple of shades darker when it's dried. So I'm just going to make sure it's nice and mixed. Like that. Put my palette knife down. Then we're going to grab our 1/4 inch angled brush. We're going to wet it in some water And we're going to grab that gray paint with our brush, and we're going to just start filling in the buildings. So I like to just do the edges first, just makes it a little bit easier, and then fill in the rest of it after the edges are done. But you can paint it in any which way you'd like to. So for the edges, I like to use the chiseled edge of the angled brush to go along the straight edges like that. Just makes it a little bit easier. And even you can move around your painting too to make it easier to get to the different edges. Once you've done one building, you can go ahead and fill that in if you'd like, or you can do all the edges and then fill them all in. And then to fill in the block in larger areas with the angled brush, you can just use the whole side of the brush to fill in that or block in that paint. And also it helps to cut around the edges of the fence by using that chiseled edge again. That's the beauty of the angled brush, is you can cut around different corners and angles. And then once we're done filling in the buildings, we're going to wait for that gray paint to dry, and then we're going to go ahead and add in the windows over top. All right, once you've filled in the gray portion of the buildings, we're gonna leave that dry to the touch, and then we're gonna come back and we're gonna mix some really pale yellow paint, and we're gonna fill in the windows of our buildings. So the next step is we're gonna be painting in the windows on our buildings. So you can have fun here and pick in any design, but basically I'm going to be creating a really pale yellow and then just filling in some square and rectangular shapes inside my buildings. So you're going to take some titanium white, put that on your palette, and just a little dab of cadmium yellow medium hue, please. That. And you're going to take your palette knife and you're just going to mix that until it's a really pale yellow. And if it's still too bright, you can add in a little bit more of the titanium white to lighten it up. And when you're happy with the yellow that you've created, you're just going to pick up your angled brush or your small round brush, and you're going to wet it in water, remove the excess water on the side of your jar, and then you're going to pick up some paint. And you can start on any of the buildings that you like. So I'm going to start on this one here in the middle. So for this one, I'm going to be creating 2 rows of square-ish shapes all the way down with a circle right at the top. So you can follow along with this pattern, or you can create any pattern you wish. Just have fun here. And they can even be a little bit lopsided. It doesn't have to be perfect. Squares or rectangles can be a little bit lopsided too. Again, the goal here is just to have fun and enjoy the process. And sometimes it actually looks better when it's not so even and a little bit irregular. that, and then I'm going to do a little bit circle at the top. So I'm going to switch over to my round brush because it gives me a little bit more control over my brush stroke. I'm going to put down the other brush. It's hard to paint with two brushes in the hand. And I'm going to just make a simple circle at the top. Just like that. There we go. So that building is done. I'm just going to wet the paintbrush in my jar of water. And then the next one I'm going to start on is this building here on the right. So I'm going to do 3 rows of rectangular-ish shapes. So not quite square, but a little bit longer like that. And I'm going to keep it in line with those triangles as best as I can. Again, just have fun here and just get those shapes down. And for these rectangular shapes, it's easier to use the flat edge of the brush and then just swoop down like that. And then if you find your paint is a little bit transparent, because with yellow paint, the nature of yellow is a little bit transparent to begin with, you can go over that with another coat if you want like a brighter yellow. Just wait till it dries a bit and then you can go over it with another coat of that yellow paint. And a trick to getting yellow to be more opaque is to add more titanium white to it. So these are a little bit more rectangular, some are a little bit squarish, but that's okay. Just having fun here. A nice city skyline at night. Something magical about a city skyline at night with all the lights. There we go. So I'm happy with that building. Now I'm going to move on to this one over here. And this one in the original painting has like a square-ish windows down the center and then more rectangular on either side. So I'm going to try that out. So I'm going to put down the center of this building here. I'm going to add in more square-like shapes. All the way down. Doesn't have to be perfect. Oops. Okay, this one's more of a rectangle, so we'll go with that. Go, and then on either side of the squares, I'm just gonna flip over the paintbrush to the chisel side just to get more of a line. Just makes it easier to paint in those thinner lines when you're using the chiseled side of that angled brush. There we go. So that works well when you're painting in any lines. Any thin line shape is just to flip over the brush to that chiseled side. And then you can pick up more paint as you go. It's good to vary the shapes in all these buildings. So here I have squares, here I have more rectangular shapes, and here I have a mix of the thin line shaped windows with the squares in the middle. So it gives variation in the look of those windows, which gives the painting a little bit more interest to the eye. So here I can go over some of the windows that are a little bit more transparent and make them more opaque with the second layer of that yellow paint. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to this painting, this building here on the right. And those from the original painting are more rectangular and longer. So I'm going to try that out as well. So for those, I'm also going to use that chiseled side of the brush and make those longer rectangles. Okay, so that's the building on the right. Now I'm going to do the final building on the edge of the painting, and for that one I'm going to try to do two small squarish shapes with horizontal then rectangular lines going in between them, just to give variation in the types of windows, types of shapes that we see. So try to squeeze it in because this building here is a little bit narrow. So you just do your best. So I'm going to go ahead and do all those square bigger window shapes, and then afterwards I'm going to come in and paint in those horizontal lines. So just give yourself a little bit of room to create that horizontal line in between those rows of squares. Oops. Go. So now I'm going to come and add in, I'm just going to flip over to the chiseled side and just add in these horizontal lines wherever I can. So I can only fit them at the top too, so I'm good with that. Okay, so those buildings are done. So we have 2 final buildings on the left. So for that, I'm gonna look at my original painting here. And we have this combination of horizontal, this rectangular horizontal window with 2 vertical ones. So that's a cool pattern. So I'm gonna try that as well. For that, I'm gonna reload my brush and I'm gonna flip over to that, the side of the angled brush, and I'm just going to lay the brush down on the side like that and just sweep across, and that creates that horizontal rectangular window in like one stroke, and like that. And for the vertical ones, I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to flip the brush over to the other side, and then I'm going to just sweep down like that. I'm going to do that for both of the windows, like that. Okay, so that pattern is done, and I'm going to just repeat that. So I'm going to do another horizontal one by flipping over my brush on its side and just sweeping across, and then doing the vertical windows here. And I think I have room for one more horizontal window here, so I'm going to just do that. There we go. And that building is done. Okay, so one final building here. If you look at the example, then we have the vertical windows here, and then we have squares in the middle. So I'm going to do the squares in the middle of the building as my first row. That gives me the center, and then I can do the windows on either side easier, a little bit easier that way. So just nice squares, like that. And they don't have to be perfect squares, they can be a little bit rounded, like mine. A combination of both. There we go. And I have room for one more. There we go. And now on either side, I'm going to do longer windows like that, vertical windows, just to give a variation at the shapes that we see in the buildings. So 1, 2, I think I'll be able to fit 4 in total. So I'm going to do one here, another one going down here, and then a final one below that. And there we go. And you can keep it in line with that center one if you would like as well. And then we have one more row on this side, so let's see if we can squeeze that in. There we go. And we can just use the guideline over here, so I know I have one window here, and one that starts over here. You can reload the brush too when you're running out of paint. One right there, and then one final one below that. There we go. All right, for the next step, while we wait for the yellow windows to dry, we can actually move on to painting in our moon and our night sky. So for that, you can just sketch in a rough round shape, or you can look around your home for something that's round. I have this nice candle here, so I'm going to use that as a template and just going to trace around that. So I'm going to place that roughly in the middle of the canvas. I'm going to take a pencil, and if I have any lead in here, there we go. Just gonna trace around it, so it's just easier for me to know where to paint. That. And again, you don't have to do this. You can just roughly put in or sketch in a rough shape of a circle, like that. Once you're done that, we're going to take some titanium white, pure titanium white, and put that down on our palette. Just a little bit. We don't need that much for the moon. So for the first step, we're going to take our small round brush, and we're just going to paint in that round circle just with plain white paint, white titanium white paint. So we can just fill it in. Simple. And I actually have, if you want to paint a realistic looking moon, I have a tutorial on how to paint a realistic looking moon. Here I'm just going to go over some basic steps, but if you want to do something a little bit more realistic, you can check out that video. So I'll put a link in the description below for that one. So we're just gonna fill that in as best as we can. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can see the brush strokes. That's gonna actually add to the beauty of the moon. Some variation in those brush strokes. Having some texture in the moon is good. Just like that. So once we're done with that white paint we filled in the moon with our white titanium white paint, we can leave it to dry just for a minute or so. It's a really thin layer, so it won't take that long to dry. And once that's dry, we're going to come back and we're going to add in a dark gray paint to paint in those larger moon craters. So we can, while we wait for that to actually dry, we can go ahead and mix our darker gray paint. So we're going to take some Mars Black, and we're going to put a dollop of it on the side, just a little bit, because black is very pigmented and it can quickly overpower that white. So we want to add a small amount of black at a time just to make a nice gray, like a charcoal gray paint. So I'm just going to take my palette knife and add just a smidgen of it over in another pile, like that. I put my paintbrush down while I do that. And then I'm going to add in double or triple amount of that titanium white and see where we get what shade of gray we get with that. And then we can adjust. It's easier to work with a lighter mixture and darken it up versus having a darker mixture and then lightening it up. That just uses a little bit more paint. So that's nice and dark. I want it to be a little bit more darker than that. So I'm going to grab just a smidgen more of that paint just on the tip of my palette knife, and I'm going to mix it in slowly just until I get to that nice charcoal gray. It's getting there. And also keep in mind too, with acrylic paints, many of them dried in a darker shade, 1 or 2 shades darker than they are when they're wet. So just keep that in mind when you're mixing your paints as well. So that's going to dry a little bit darker. So I'm happy with that. That's a nice charcoal gray. All right, so now once the white of the moon is dry to the touch, we're going to come and take our round brush. We're going to pick up some of that charcoal gray paint, and we're going to paint in those larger moon craters. So to do that, we're just going to paint in kind of like a kidney bean shape on the lower left portion of the moon, just like that. It comes until about the center of the moon, so we're going to make it a little bit bigger. Nice kidney bean shape. And then we're going to paint in kind of like a tail on its side. So it could be kind of like a little animal, maybe a little squirrel. You can have fun there. Paint in that kind of tail shape. That. Yeah, looks like a little squirrel. And then we're going to paint in 6 round-ish shapes. So they don't have to be perfectly round. They're kind of irregular. So you're going to do 3 there. And you're going to do 2 at the bottom, like that. Not quite round, they're not quite squares, not quite rectangles. They're kind of in between all those things. And I'm going to paint one at the top over here, like that. Okay, so that's our larger moon craters. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create an even lighter shade of that gray, and we're going to add a little bit more variation to that gray color, so it blends a little bit more with that white of the background of the moon. So we can put our paintbrush down, and then we can grab a little bit more of that titanium white and add it in. I'm not going to add it into the whole mixture because that's not going to lighten it as fast, and I don't want to waste a lot of that white paint. So I'm going to add it just to like a little portion of that paint at the bottom here. So you can see the comparison, like this is the original charcoal gray paint, and this is the lighter one that I've created. So you can, as long as you can see the difference, the contrast between them, that's a good gray to use. So I'm happy with that. I put my palette knife down. I'm going to clean off my brush so I can get that nice lighter gray paint on it. And I'm going to pick that up. And here we're just going to have fun here. So we're just going to add some of that lighter gray paint on the outside of that darker paint. So in between that darker craters that we created and that white of that moon, that's going to give us a little bit more of a realistic look. So it's not quite the white and the dark gray. It's going to give a more graduated look between those different shades. So just like that, and just have fun here. Even if that dark gray is not quite dry, that's okay. Actually, with blending, it's better when the paint is actually wet. That's where you can get good blends in. So I'm gonna go around the shapes I've created in that previous step. Just add that lighter gray along the edges of it. And you can add some in the center too if you want, some dabs. Because the craters of the moon, they often look like little speckles, like the smaller ones look like more speckles. So you can add those in too, which we're going to do in the next step. So these are the larger ones we're working with right now. And the darker portion of them is just going to give more depth to those craters. Like that. So that's all we really have to do for that step. And now in the next one, we're going to create those, like I mentioned, those little tiny speckles. Those are really tiny craters. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that same brush, we're going to clean it off first, and we're going to pick up some pure titanium white. So we don't want any of that black or gray mixed in with that titanium white. So if you have any of that on your palette right now, you're going to pick that up. So again, just pure white. And we're just going to dab it. Actually, it might work better if we dry that first, because what's going to happen is that white and that gray is going to mix and we're not going to get those pure white speckles on it. So let's make sure that dries. I'm going to take my hairdryer and I'm going to quickly dry it up. But if you don't have the hairdryer, just let it dry for a couple minutes, 5 minutes, and then you can continue on to the next step. All right, so it's nice and dry now to touch. So I'm going to take that white paint on the tip of my brush and I'm going to add in smaller craters. So they're going to be like little dots all over the moon. So you can add them in any places you want here. And if you want to, you can add a little bit more. You can bring a little bit more of that white back and you can paint around those craters we created just to give a little bit more pop of that white. So you can add some specks here and then come along and add a little bit more white to the edges of that moon and between those craters too. And some can be smaller, some can be bigger because there's different sizes of moon craters too. And add a little bit more white around the edges. Adding white around the edge of the moon gives a little bit more of that glowing moon look too. So you can do that, some pure titanium white around the edges of that moon. And add some of that little dabs. You can just dab it too, like that. It doesn't have to be perfectly round speckles. You can also do the splatter method here too if you want. There we go. And you can have fun here too. So if you find you've added a little bit too much white, then if you still have some of that gray paint that's on your palette, then you can bring that onto your paintbrush too and just blend. So just have fun. That darker paint too. Just enjoy this part. So once you're happy with the amount of gray and the white you've added onto your moon, we're going to let that dry. And then we're going to come in and add small speckles of that darker paint around some of those tiny white craters just to give more depth to them. So we're going to take our paintbrush and we're going to, I'm going to darken it up just a little bit. Adding a little bit more black into that that dark gray mixture. That. Then I'm going to pick up a clean brown paintbrush, and I'm going to pick up a little bit of paint on the end of the paintbrush, and I'm going to come around some of these smaller craters on the moon, like those little speckles we created in the last step, and I'm just going to create little circles around them like that, and that's just going to create a little bit more dimension to those smaller craters. Just like that. And you can add some more of that dark paint if you like it. The more varying shades of gray you use here, the more realistic it's going to look. So you can add a little bit more of that darker gray here too once you've added in those rings around those tiny white dots. Go. That. Okay, so once you're happy with that, we can leave that to dry, and the next step we're going to paint in our two cats sitting on our fence. So the next step is we're going to be painting in our two cats sitting on our fence, so those two here. We want to make sure that the yellow windows on our buildings are nice and dry to the touch. And once they are, we're going to take our paintbrush and we're going to take some, if you have still some of that Mars Black on your palette, we're just going to take pure Mars Black on our paintbrush. And we're going to paint these cats with simple shapes. So the first one we're going to do on the right hand side, and we're going to do the body first because that's just a simple way to paint the cat. So what we're going to do is we're going to just paint in an oval shape, and it's going to come roughly, so I'm going to paint it in this building here, and it's going to come roughly up to the center of this building. So just a nice oval shape. Like that. Comes all the way down to the fence. So just a simple oval shape like that. And now for the head, we're going to take a bit more black paint and we're going to paint in a circle at the top of that oval. So we're going to take our paintbrush and we're just going to paint a circle. And we want it to be a little bit wider than the body. Okay, so you can make it a little bit wider like that if you want. Now we're going to paint in the ears. So the ears are just going to be simple triangles. So we're going to paint in two little triangles at the top of that circle. You can make them a little bit pointy, just like that. Doesn't have to be perfect here, like that. And now we're going to paint in the legs. So the cats are kind of sitting on the fence, so their legs are going to be folded. So we're just going to paint in two narrow ovals, small ovals at the bottom of this larger oval here. So one oval like that, and then another oval like that on the other side of that larger body oval. So that's the rough shape of the cat. And now for the fun part, we're going to paint in a nice squiggly tail. So you're going to take the center of the bottom of the cat, and you're just going to have fun and paint in a squiggly tail like that. It could be curly at the end, or just nice and wavy, more straighter. Kind of paint in the tail that you're feeling. There we go. It could be bushy too. You can have a little bit more of those hairs kind of fraying at the ends, just like that. So that's one cat. So for the other one, we're going to paint it on the left of this one. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to repeat with painting in the body shape, which is just a simple large oval. And we're going to paint it slightly lower than that one. Just a nice oval going all the way down to the fence. And this painting was actually inspired by my daughter. She did a beautiful sketch of the cat painting. She loves cats. So she did the sketch, and she's the one who inspired me for this painting. And she draws and paints cats and things way better than I do. And we're going to paint in the head. Just a simple circle at the top. Like that. So this cat can be a little bit smaller or bigger or the same size. Two cats looking up at the moon or at the skyline, or both. And now we're going to paint in the ears, and the ears are just simple triangles. So we're going to paint in one here like that. And we're going to paint in one on the other side. If you run out of paint, you can just pick up some more on your paintbrush. Go. And now the fun part, we're going to add in our squiggly tail. So for this one, I'm going to add the tail coming up instead of going down towards the fence. I'm going to add a little bit more paint on my paintbrush. So I'm going to swoop it upwards onto this building over here. And maybe a little curl at the end. Like that. Oh, and we forgot, I forgot the legs. So there's just two small little ovals on either side of the body. So we're going to just paint those in. And the other one is on this side. It's going to blend in a little bit with that tail, but that's okay. And those are just the knees. There we go. And that's for the cats. So the cats are now done. So as one final touch, we can add in 2 shooting stars into our magical night sky. So to do that, I like to use, you can use pure white paint with your round brush, or I just like to use a paint marker. It just gives my hand a little bit more dexterity when painting the really small dots. So I just like to use that. But again, if you don't have the paint marker, just go ahead and use your smallest round brush with some pure white paint and add in some 2 to any amount of shooting stars you want in the night sky. So I'm going to add them here on the right. Add one right here. So you just add a dot and then a nice tail, shooting star tail, and it can have a little bit like a dotted line. That make the dot a little bit bigger, and then another one over here. And that's the tail. There we go. Adds a little bit more magic into the sky. And that is our final painting. Hope you enjoyed.